Okay, so I know that your career began when you were still in high school
Yeah.
with KGGF.
Wow, that's good. Yes.
Yeah.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, so you've been doing this for a very long time. So have you ever pictured yourself doing anything else?
Not really, not seriously. I mean, I really began thinking about wanting to be in radio and broadcasting when I was in elementary school, which is kind of strange, right? And the most accessible way to gain entry to the profession was when I was growing up in this small town in Kansas where that radio station is still located. My dad wanted me to get a job in the summer, and I was 15 years old. And it was in rural Kansas. And my dad, who was a journalist, didn't think at all that I was serious about becoming a journalist. And I didn't really have a conversation with him about it. He just said, you know, you got to get a summer job. Well, the easiest job to get was being a peach picker down the road. But in the Kansas summer heat, that's not a job that you really want to have, and the money probably was not any better than in broadcasting. So I started hanging out at the local radio station and really hung out for, I don't know, a number of months, never even thinking to ask for pay. But I learned how to do the things that people needed to do in a radio station, which ultimately was about just getting programming on the air, baseball, the Texaco Metropolitan Opera and things like that. And you'd sit in a control room and run the controls. While I was doing that one day, running the controls, a baseball game was rained out. And in a small station like that, you know, they don't bring somebody in to do the show. If you're in the studio, you end up playing the records. You know, so I did that. I went to journalism school at the University of Kansas, and I continued to work all along. So I always worked and tried to get better at what I did, and always thought it was important to try to, you know, master the skills that are in the profession, whether it's writing or audio editing or video editing, and telling a story. The ability to tell a story is very important, and so I've always loved that, no matter what the story is. Earlier in my AP career, I've been here 24 years this summer, I covered the music industry, and I love telling the story about, you know, I interviewed Run DMC one day, right? Or one day I interviewed a country artist, and you know, there's an enthusiasm that most journalists have about wanting to tell the story that you're working at that given time. It might have been something that had to do with politics along the way, covering the state legislature in Kansas, which I did for 3 years while I was in college. So I've always loved the story I'm working at any given time. So I've never really seriously thought about leaving the business because I do love it. That was a long answer, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, helps me out. You're very talented in several different areas of this, reporting, anchoring, writing.
Well, thank you for that
producing.
presumption. I appreciate that.
Well,
No, I appreciate that. It's very nice of you to say that. Thank you.
my pleasure. Well, which area do you prefer? Like, which is your very favorite?
Yeah. No, the reporting part is the part that I like the best. I was most unhappy doing the work that had to do with being a radio anchor, where you're writing a newscast toward the next hour, you know, for 4 or 5 hours a shift, because you're away from the story. And to me, the best thing about reporting is dealing with people and asking people what they think about the story you're working on. In other words, you know, whether it's a story about Ben's Chili Bowl here in DC that I'm working on right now, about places the president's eaten at, or something more substantially serious that could be, you know, a problem that we're encountering. I've covered the economy very closely for about 15 years, and those are serious stories that affect people in a real way. So when I have the ability, or I have the luxury of interviewing somebody who has a stake in the story, whether they're an expert or they're just a consumer who's knowledgeable about how the economy is affecting them, that's what I really love to do the most, is getting out and working the story and then putting the story together. And sometimes in the creative process, whether you're doing something that's relatively short for radio that might be no more than 40 seconds, or a TV piece that could be up to 4 minutes long, which is long in broadcast terms. There's a kind of a tortuous process that goes on where you're trying to think, how am I going to tell this story with the elements, the video elements that I have for the story, and sometimes when you're at the very beginning of that process, it's like working a puzzle, because you're thinking, how am I going to go from A to Z in this story with the pieces I have? And that really is a creative challenge, and it's ultimately very rewarding, because when you're finished with it, you're happy that you got through that process, no matter how it turned out. I mean, it's just a creative process that you have to work through. So some of them are very quick. When you're doing a radio piece, you might turn the radio piece around, in other words, write it, go in the studio, voice it, and then put the sound element, the newsmaker portion of the sound in the piece. That may only take 15 minutes, by the time you turn around. So that's quick. So that's not quite as rewarding, although there's instant gratification, as where you're working on the video piece, where it's a longer creative process, where maybe you've gone out on the street and worked with 2 or 3 different video photographers to gather the video, and then ultimately you've gone over a draft or 2 where you write the piece. But I think those processes that involve reporting are the ones that I really do enjoy the most.
Thank you. And my last question would be, after all, you've worked hard to get where you are, what has been the hardest thing of your entire journey?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I don't know if it's the hardest thing, but it's the biggest challenge. Is a lot of people think when they get into broadcasting, or some form of the broadcast profession, or doing the creative work that's involved with that there's a lot of I guess public adoration might be the way you could put it, but at the end of the day, that's overblown. Very few people are truly recognized on the street in the broadcast profession, because frankly there's so many people that are on the air, at the end of the day. And that, combined with the fact that the job is so demanding. In other words, you have to be able to turn material out quickly and with some degree of skill, so that you don't create errors, that you don't make major mistakes, and that you do the story reasonably well. Ultimately, you have to be your own harshest critic, and also give yourself the freedom to say, I did that as well as I can, because you're not going to get that kind of feedback from anyone else, and ultimately, in a way, not even your family, no matter how great your family is. So you have to be both your harshest critic, but also you have to say that I know I did a good job when you gave it your best. And that's very hard, because no matter where you're working in the broadcast profession, there's always someone who's in back of you who can replace you. There's no one who isn't replaceable in the broadcast profession, even though people make the mistake and think that they're irreplaceable. And that's when you read in the paper that person lost their job. So you have to realize that you are your own worst critic. Demand excellence of yourself, and then also just give yourself your own a pat on the back for yourself at the end of the day, and say, I did demand the most, and I really did try to do the best I could. And that really is those are some of the biggest challenges that I've been familiar with over the years.
Thank you so much.
Hey, it was my pleasure. Thank you.